Welcome, seekers, to our channel. We're glad that you're here today. Today's episode is going to be a little dark, just the warning. And I'd like to introduce myself, Angel, and my co host, Dante. Welcome, Dante.
Howdy, y'all.
So, today we're going to be talking about two different subjects. During my segment, we're going to be speaking a little bit about human sacrifice throughout the world in current times. And we're also going to be doing a segment on some more esoteric items, more occult items, including some information that we have about a super soldier program. So, just to kick this off, throughout history, going back to ancient times, there's been a very rich and very dark history of human sacrifice. And this is across different cosmologies, across different belief systems. So no single religion, no single people anywhere in the world had a monopoly on sacrifice. So the idea goes, and this is going back to the time of the Sumerians, is that yes, there was a pantheon of gods, deities, demons, good guys and bad guys looking down on us. And in order to gain their favor, the gods or the demons wanted something in return. As they say in the world, that there's nothing free, nothing comes for free. So you needed to have a little bit of skin in the game before you got the benefit of any divine intervention. So think about, imagine what it would be like, Dante, to live in the ancient world. There's no TV, there's no commute, no traffic, a little bit of less stress on one hand, right?
Absolutely.
Man, you don't have a traffic piled up on the prairie hunting for the buffalo. It's not going to happen.
Well, you have a day-to-day uh, stress for survival in those ancient times, and they didn't have a lot of conveniences.
Exactly.
So,
No medicine, no modern scientific thought. Well,
well, I don't
yes,
know about that.
they had their medicine, but they didn't have the benefit of modern antibiotics, modern antiviral medications. They had their own form of medicine, which worked in some cases, but in other cases, maybe didn't work so well. So people in the ancient world turned to their priests, the shaman, the medicine woman, medicine man. Many times they would look for divine intervention because you're right, they didn't have modern stress, but at the same time, many of the things that we take for granted, like food being easily available, they just didn't have it. I mean, imagine what it would be like for ancient man if they had a really bad rain season and they're relying on these crops. What happens?
Well, uh, farms are a relatively new phenomenon, about 9,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't doing farming, so the rainy season would not wipe out their crops,
Right, the hunter gatherers would not be worried about that, but
but it would wipe out what they're gathering.
yes, could drive the animals away. It could cause berries that they rely on during certain seasons not to be available. So,
Fruits, vegetables, herbal foods.
yeah, roots, tubers. So, ancient man was really at the mercy, and even during the agricultural period, ancient man was at the mercy of the whim of weather, the whim of Mother Nature.
Always been.
Always, exactly. And because they didn't have many of the modern understandings that we take for granted nowadays, they turned to religious beliefs, magical beliefs, in order to understand the world, the constellations, the gods, stories that had been passed down from generation to generation. And they knew that if the gods were not appeased, if the gods were angry, bad things would happen. So there was sacrifice. People were expected to give something in return for something in order to get either something that they wanted good weather, good crops, good hunting, depending on the society. But also, they wanted protection from the terrors of the night. They wanted protection from monsters, spirits, evil, luck, jinn. They walked in many empty, scary places. So think about voodoo. Think about the old traditions, hoodoo, where you would leave rum, pour out rum at the crossroads, where you might meet the devil who would grant you wishes. Even,
I
uh,
would I think there's two different kind of lines of information that have come down. One is through shaman that
mhm,
who've studied nature, um, astronomy, etc., and the other being a religious cult that uh, spread, um, not coming from this purely shamanic stream of information. Um, this religious cult um, called came out of India called the Kalima,
mhm.
and it went global. It influenced. These are the same people who went into Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Americas. They spread that dark religious cult globally.
Yeah, and it's funny that you mentioned the cult of Kali because um, we are going to be talking a little bit about some of the tantric practices of the Kali cult. Very, very interesting people. So you're absolutely spot on. But going back to older times, around the time of the spread of Kali, but I mean, think about the things that people were willing to give up in order to get the protection or curry the favor of the gods. Here in the U.S., the Native Americans would give away cornmeal. They would offer food to the gods or incense or prayers. And then we look at the Aztec and the Mayan traditions. They were very, well, let's say that they were a little darker. Some cultures it was okay to just give food and that was acceptable. Others would sacrifice animals. We know the voodoo tradition, Santeria, they would sacrifice animals. But if we look at the Aztec, Mesoamerica, and the Mayan traditions, in order to curry favor with their gods, they would have festivals which could only be described as blood orgies, where literally thousands of captured prisoners would be sacrificed to their war god, Huitzilopochtli. They had Quetzalcoatl, where they would throw people off of the steps of their great pyramids and tear their hearts out. And these were wholesale massacres. It was a very bloody time in history. So people think, wow, the Mesoamericans were crazy, they were bloodthirsty. But
They didn't
then,
start out that way.
no.
Actually, the early Mayans were not into ritual human sacrifice. That came later as
Yes,
times became more and more desperate. Desperate times call for desperate measures.
exactly.
They became, they started, ramping up their sacrifice to see if they could, you know, change their luck, so to speak. Um, you can go back into very ancient times about ritual sacrifice. Tens of thousands of years ago, the chieftain, after a 50-year reign, would be sacrificed and eaten by the other people. They would want to consume some of the power of their chief.
Hmm. Yes.
Um, the and also, it's been written that in ancient times the veil between the worlds was a lot thinner. So those who were, everybody was more connected to the earth because they didn't have our modern distractions, as you mentioned.
Right.
Um, but the ones that were the most connected, the shaman or the priest, whatever term you want to give them, would be able to experience these other worlds more easily, more regularly, and so they could differentiate between positive, neutral, and negative spirit beings.
Yes. And they could pierce the veil and they could more or less tell what kind of sacrifices the gods required.
Well, I think what we would call maybe angels and demons, spiritual entities from either a lighter realm or a darker realm. Seems to me the ones in the darker realm are obviously feeding off our negative energy, our fear, our anger. Um, what someone is called Loosh. That this is the name of they give for the energy that they use that's they feed off humanity.
Emotional energy, yeah.
Negative emotional energy. I think maybe that lighter beings also feed off of us, but they feed off of our light energy, off our love, kindness, and compassion. So they're both feeding off of us. They just have different basic intentions:
Different sides to the same coin.
selfishness,
Yeah.
selflessness, etc., etc.
Well, going back to older times, sometimes people think, well, sacrifice was only done by these quote unquote savage tribes, but if you look in the Bible, the Old Testament particularly, we find some very very interesting references to sacrifice. We had cases where God would wipe out entire cities. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah, um,
Jericho.
Jericho, yes, and there was also many stories about people sacrificing their sons and daughters to fire. Fire was this it was a very common thread in the Old Testimony. You
The
look at
Old Testament, yeah,
Old Testament,
it talks
yes,
about not passing your children through the fires of Moloch.
yes. You look at Deuteronomy 12:31, sons and daughters consecrated, and by consecrated I mean cast into the fire. Exodus 13:2, very interesting. Consecrate to me every firstborn that opens the womb among Israelites, both man and beast, for it belongs to me. And again, in this passage, consecrate means specifically burn them because God wants to smell the sacrifices.
No, they
Uh,
want the child to suffer.
yeah,
The dark gods feed off the suffering.
yeah, and whole towns, Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 13 through 19, put the entire town to torch as a burnt, again,
Offering,
fire offering
burnt offering.
to the Lord your God. And one more, Ezekiel chapter 21, verse 33 through 37. I will hand you over to ravaging men, artisans of destruction. You shall be fuel for the fire. Your blood shall flow throughout the land, and you shall not be remembered, for I, the Lord, have spoken. So they had a thing for fire. they, they were really big on fire, and yeah,
Interestingly, the term Holocaust actually means to be sacrificed by fire. So it's not really so much applicable. Although, well, no, I take that back. Some were burnt in the ovens.
yeah, they were burnt in the ovens. But it's just kind of a very interesting thread. The research that I did was just human sacrifice, very specifically using fire. It was a very common theme. And the reason that I brought this up is that when we talk about certain religious beliefs, it's easy to point fingers at cultures that may not be Western cultures and, point fingers and say, yeah, 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 look, they're doing all this crazy, bad stuff. But we also have to look inwardly, saying, hey, we have our own history. Our hands are not any cleaner than anyone else's hands.
Kind of like the Catholics talking about the heathens, and they're doing stuff that's even worse than what the so-called heathens were
Oh
doing.
yeah, Spanish Inquisition, or even look what they did to the Aztec people when they brought in their diseases, they brought in their priests. It
It was
was
just Aztec people. I mean, it's all Native American peoples, and
all of
just
Mesoamerica, yes.
no, not just Middle America. In North America, the Indians were given, uh, you know, blankets with chicken pox. It
Hmm.
was germ warfare.
Germ
It was
warfare.
done on purpose. They were killing off the natives so that they could take over the land.
The sad thing is those blankets were given to them as gifts. Like here you go.
Yeah,
please accept our gifts of nice warm blankets. Not much of a great gift. Not at all. So I want to talk about a book. It's called Human Sacrifice by Jimmy Lee Shreve. It's a source material that I used for a lot of my research. And this author goes into a very interesting history that I was previously unaware of. And pretty much the main point centers around a cluster of religions, Afro Cuban religions, many of which had their origins around religions that were practiced by the Yoruba people, the Yoruba tribes that are located in modern day Nigeria. So you think, well, human sacrifice, that was way in the past. That doesn't happen anymore. And if you thought that, you would be absolutely 100% wrong. For example, July 17th, 2000, a 74-year-old woman named Margaret Ramirez was run over while crossing a street in New York. She was run over and killed. So the police naturally go to her apartment to see if she has any next of kin. They knock on the door, inform her son of what has just happened, and the son completely goes mad. He goes ballistic to the point where the cops had to take the son away in handcuffs. They arrested him, they took him away. He was a danger to himself and others. But when the cops showed up to this apartment in New York City, they noticed that there was a very strong odor emanating from this apartment. It smelled wrong. So the cops go in. And what they found inside that apartment is incredible. Inside, they found a cauldron with skulls. It was the a skull of a child, um, either 1 or maybe 2 years of age, and the skull still had rotting meat on the skull itself. It was inside a cauldron, and in the different rooms of the house there was graveyard dirt. The house smelled like a mixture of incense and death. So what they were doing is they were burning incense in order to cover the smell of the rotting flesh of the sacrifices that were made in this apartment. So you would think that's really bad. Can't get any worse. But it gets a lot worse. In one of the rooms, they found a jar filled with formaldehyde, and inside the jar, they found a fully formed newborn baby girl who still had a surgical clamp around her umbilical cord. This child was never identified. But the woman who rented this apartment, Margaret Ramirez, was a practitioner of a religion called Palo Mayombe. And Palo Mayombe is a darker offshoot of a cluster of religions, Afro-Cuban religions, which include Santeria, Hoodoo, Voodoo. So they're cousins, but they're not 100% the same. But what Palo Mayombe is nothing less than modern day necromancy. So the roots of this religion, it's a very interesting religion. Margaret Ramirez, she was paid by members of the community in New York, by people who knew what she did, in order to cast spells using these skulls. The whole origin of this religion, it was brought to the Caribbean by slaves from the Congo. When slaves were brought to the Congo, they brought their religious beliefs, and they brought a belief that was very similar to Santeria, modern day Santeria. And Santeria is again a religious belief that's based on a tribe of people called the Yoruba, who come from Nigeria. Well, when they arrived in the Caribbean, they were essentially forced to adopt Catholicism. And what happened was a type of religious syncretism where they took aspects of Catholicism, aspects of Santeria, and aspects of the Ifa Yoruba religion, and they mixed it all together.
Yeah, they renamed their spirits with Catholic saint names.
Bingo. So instead of being Saint John the Baptist, when they're talking about, Saint John, they're really talking about an Orisha. They could be talking about Ogun or
Did you know that mumbo jumbo is an African spirit?
yeah, I've heard about that. And do you remember I Love Lucy when Ricky Ricardo used to talk about Baba Luaye? Yeah, Baba Luaye is an Orisha also. He was sneaking in a little bit of cult knowledge there in the song, whether he knew it
They always do.
or not. Yeah. So this religion, they use a cauldron. It's an iron cauldron, and in this iron cauldron, they call this cauldron. It's a magical cauldron called an inganga. It's a Nganga. So I may be mispronouncing it. It's an inganga, and the spirits of the dead are said to live inside this cauldron. They keep skulls of the dead, and they believe the palero, which is what they call the practitioners of this art, their priests, believe that by keeping the skulls of the dead inside the nganga, which is the cauldron, that they can control the spirits of the dead, and the spirits of the dead can be sent to do certain things, either bring back information, protect you from the police, or to curse, hex an enemy.
Yeah, they possess someone.
Yeah, it's modern day necromancy. It's very classical. And when the spirits of the dead came through and did whatever this palero wanted, they would repay the spirit by putting into this cauldron blood, sacrifices of blood, typically from sacrificed animals. So inside a typical cauldron, you would find a mix of skulls, bones, graveyard dirt, which harkens back a little bit to the vampire traditions, and blood. Blood was what you fed these spirits.
And that brings us forward to the subject of adrenochrome.
Hmm.
I learned recently that in some of the East Asian countries where they eat dogs, for example, they like to uh, sadly they put the dogs into boiling water because they want the dogs to suffer before they slaughter them. Because much like with these entities feeding off of adrenochrome, the uh, the the meat tastes better apparently with that infusion of adrenaline, um,
Wow.
which is actually the opposite of kosher. The concept of kosher is to make sure that the animal's not suffering, that you're being nice to it, you make it suffer as little as possible, so that the system isn't uh, infused with that substance.
I might be wrong, but I was also understanding that when meat is prepared in the Islamic tradition,
Whoa,
halal,
whoa!
that um, when meat is prepared that way, it's also prepared with an eye to kindness to the animal to try to make it suffer less. Much like kosher slaughtering is supposed to make the animal suffer less, but some traditions want the animal to suffer more, and that I find it hard to get my mind around this. Why would you want an animal to suffer more?
Well, apparently you get addicted to the adrenochrome.
Yeah, I mean that I could see that
If
happening.
you get high off of it, you chase that high just like chasing any dragon.
Yeah, you're chasing the high, the adrenaline rush, or the in this case the adrenochrome rush. So going back to this book, the author was able to find evidence of human sacrifices related to these religions, going back to 1903 in Cuba, where he found records of a young girl who had been sacrificed for this religion. So one would think, well, in more modern times, people got wiser, smarter. They're not going around sacrificing people anymore. And again, if we believe that, we would be wrong. In 1986, in Miami, a baby had been found murdered. Its tongue and eyelids were cut off and offered to Palo gods, to Palo spirits. In that very same year, 1986, in Florida, an inganga was found in a drug dealer's house, and inside this cauldron, two skulls that still had rotting human flesh attached to them. No sign of embalming. So obviously, this means that the skulls were not um, stolen from a grave where they'd been embalmed or purchased from a supply house. These skulls belonged to people who'd been specifically murdered, and their heads were severed for this purpose of being used as the tools of a palero. Also, in 1988, there's a case in New Jersey where a child pornography ring was broken up. Cops came in and they found a Apollo altar. And get this, on the Apollo altar, they found a large container filled with blood. And the idea, or at least what the cops believed, was that this container contained the blood of children who had been used to produce these child pornography, these pornographic movies. However, they never found the children from where this blood was drained. So we're not really sure what happened to the children that were murdered, whose blood was drained to fill this container as an offering to the Apollo spirits. Do you remember Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian strongman?
Of course.
Well, when this guy was captured, when he was finally captured or by the American authorities, they found in his house a giant Apollo altars, and they found evidence of magic, both in the Palo Mayombe tradition and in the Santeria tradition. In fact, they found so much occult stuff in his house that the Army brought in a specialist, a man named Chief Warrant Officer James R. Dibble, who is the Army's, or at that time was the Army's specialist in all things dealing with the occult. Because they found things that they just couldn't understand. They went in there and they saw skulls, bits of flesh, sacrificed chickens, pictures of different people. Henry Kissinger, Ronald Reagan, he had pictures of all these people, and he had baileros do magic works for him in order to protect them from all of these people that he was deathly afraid of. So there's a very interesting quote from Chief Warrant Officer Dibble. He said that the majority, get this, the majority of Latin American drug traffickers arrested in the US are sooner or later discovered to be devotees of either Palo Mayombe or its sister religion, Santeria. That they rely on this religion, they believe in this religion, that it will protect them from prosecution from US drug authorities. Serious.
Frankly, I believe that the phenomena is global. Okay, that these uh, illegal gangs that traffic drugs and people are part of a global system that is uh, in part, not in part, completely based on satanic ritual.
Yes.
And these illegal gangs actually answer to the legal gangs, which we call, for the most part, governments, or at least shadow governments, that are also a global network of satanic ritualists.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I mean, just going off on a slight tangent, I remember that Chase Bank and also Union Bank, they were found guilty of holding and laundering billions of dollars in drug dealer money from the cartels.
I believe that Chase is a Rockefeller bank
Yeah.
and Union Bank is a Bush bank.
Yes. Yes. I believe that, and then Union Bank has its own problems, even going back to the time of the Nazis, as far as
Well, you
yeah,
talk about Rockefellers and Bushes, man. You
yeah,
are talking about the Nazis.
going way back. I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but the banks have some blood on their hands. Let's just say
Man,
that.
the banks have all the blood on their hands. All wars are banker wars.
But I do remember that they were accepting money from drug dealers. They knew it was dirty money, and they were helping them. They were actually helping them launder this money. Such was the power of the cartels. So it's not out of this world to believe that U.S. authorities know about these religious practices, these quasi demonic or quasi satanic practices, and they know how these structures work. They know what they're looking at, and who knows? Maybe even some people in government might also be involved in these practices. It would not surprise me one bit.
Yeah, some people might be involved in some of this stuff.
We'll just leave it at some.
For those who can't see on a on a podcast, I rolled my eyes.
Yeah, just read between the lines, ladies and gentlemen, and
Read between the inflection.
yeah. So I want to go back to another very interesting case. So it was a case of Mark Kilroy. He was a University of Texas undergraduate, and they lived across the border on the U.S. side, but they lived across from a town in Mexico called Matamoros. And during spring break, it was a very time-honored tradition amongst these college students to go down into Matamoros and to party it up. It was like people in San Diego going down to Tijuana to get wasted. Same idea. So they were down there for 2 nights, and on the second night of partying, they were walking back across a bridge trying to get back onto the US side in order to get to their car and go home. There was 4 people in total. Two of the friends walked a little bit ahead, two of the friends walked a little bit behind. Kilroy was with the group that was walking behind. Kilroy's friend had to relieve himself. He had to go to the bathroom, so he ducks into an alley, tells his friend to wait. And when his friend came out, Mark Kilroy was nowhere to be found. He was missing. They looked around, they were yelling, they called the police because they couldn't find him, and Mark Kilroy had utterly disappeared. Now, Kilroy's family had connections within US Customs, so they tried to use those connections to find their son, and no luck. And they even posted a $15,000 reward for any information leading to the safe return of their son, and still no luck. It's as if the ground had swallowed this kid up. But something really interesting happened. About a month after the disappearance, there was a anti-narcotics operation in the Rio Grande Valley, and the Mexican police who were down there showed a picture of Mark Kilroy to one of the people that was being investigated. So the cops are doing an operation down the Rio Grande Valley. Somebody tries to run one of the roadblocks that had been set up to find drug traffickers. The police follow this guy that ran the roadblock. That guy leads them to a ranch. And on the ranch, they found 75 pounds of marijuana. So they were growing marijuana on this ranch. But because the investigation, the search for this kid, Mark Kilroy, was still in full effect, they showed the picture to somebody on that ranch. And somebody on that ranch, one of the farmhands, said, "Oh, yeah, I've seen him before." And he pointed to a shed, a rusty shed off in the distance. So the Mexican authorities, they approached this shed and they said that they immediately noticed a smell of rotting flesh. All around the shed, in shallow graves, they found 12 bodies of people that had been sacrificed and ritually murdered. And they were in varying states of decomposition. Supposedly, one of the victims was only 14 years old. So they were sacrificing people outside of this shed, or that's where they found the bodies. But when they went inside the shed, they found an inganga, one of the magical cauldrons filled with blood and filled with skulls that had been used by these narco traffickers to do rituals. One of the bodies that was found outside of this shed in a shallow grave was Mark Kilroy. Apparently, he'd been kidnapped as he was waiting for his friend by one of the narco assistants, one of the people that was helping the narco traffickers, because they had said, "Go and find me a white person to sacrifice." That's what the spirit wants. He wants a white person. So the guy who was in
Daily special.
charge, yeah, it's crazy. They found parts of goats, chicken parts, and apparently these guys were running a 2,000 pound 2,000 pound per week marijuana operation out of this ranch. So they were sacrificing these children, these teenagers, in order to appease their gods and to be protected from the authorities and also from other gangs that might want to come in and take over their operations. But the interesting part was that it was the guy who was in charge, the palero, the priest, was a guy called Adolfo Constanzo. He was a Cuban American. So he had grown up in Florida and he had grown up in the tradition of Santeria, but eventually he graduated into other more darker practices. So Palo Mayombe is considered a darker practice. It's a direct necromancy, whereas Santeria still has some aspects of it that are more religious in nature. So that guy was actually cornered. He wasn't on that ranch, but he was cornered in Mexico City. And in Mexico City, when they cornered this guy in an apartment, that guy asked a member of his own gang to kill him, and he did. So when the cops came in, he was already dead. But here's something very interesting. Here's where it gets crazy. Between 1987 and 1989 in Mexico City, there were 74 suspected ritual murders, most of them unsolved, and 14 of these ritual murders involved infant victims. And presumably, this stuff is still going on in Mexico.
Global.
It's crazy.
It's global.
Human sacrifice is not a thing of the past.
Most of these, the what we call organized crime, they've learned. Well, not they've learned. They know that human trafficking is actually even more profitable
Yes.
than drug trafficking.
Yeah, that's the new thing right now, human trafficking.
It's not a new thing.
Well, it's more emphasis now than before.
No, it's just coming out.
Maybe we're
It's going
starting
on
to
for
discover.
thousands of years.
Um, from what I understand, and this is my limited understanding of the trends as far as what these gangs were doing, is that um, with some of the legalization of drugs that's been happening, with some of the shifts and the difficulty in getting drugs across, there's been more of an emphasis on human trafficking into the US. So these cartels that used to emphasize pure drug drug smuggling as a business are now branching into kidnapping, extortion, and human trafficking as a way to make money as it's becoming harder and harder to make money on drugs.
It's true.
But I want to get away from Mexico and the cartels for just a little bit because we've been emphasizing Palo Mayombe.
Well,
It's hard not to say they're a very dark religion. But I do want to say that Palo Mayombe does have some positive uses. There are Palo Mayombe practitioners who use the power of the Nganga and the spirits within the Nganga to bring health to people, to help them reconnect with estranged loved ones, to help heal them from certain diseases, to bring them good luck, good fortune. So it is a community based faith in certain communities, particularly Cuban communities in Florida and New York. And people will pay these paleros as they would pay a voodoo practitioner or a palm reader to give them beneficial things
well,
in return for
presumably,
payment.
if you can get people possessed, paleros can also depossess.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Just like you would bring in a priest to depossess you. So I don't want to paint Palo Mayombe in just one color I don't want to paint broad strokes. There are some positive aspects of this religion, but it's also good to understand that it is used by drug dealers. And there's some horrifying things going on within this religion, and it is necromancy. There's no way to spin it. But I want us to go to India for just a moment. At the beginning, you mentioned the cult of Kali. So many people are familiar with the term tantra, tantric. You think of sex, tantric sex positions, but tantra is a belief system within Hinduism. It's pretty popular, and Kali was the goddess of destruction. So she was seen as a very negative being, but at the same time, Kali,
She's the dark mother.
Yes, the Dark Mother. But some people would worship her, and there was some positive things to her, so she could bring some positive things to people. For example, sacrifices to Kali were supposed to bring riches, were supposed to bring good fortune if you appeased Kali. So, what many people may not know is that at the Kali temple in Calcutta, about 200 years ago, a boy was killed there every single day. That was a tradition 200 years ago at one of the main temples in Calcutta. And that was to appease Kali, to bring favor to the people that worship there. Um, they're not allowed to do that anymore for obvious reasons. You can't kill a boy a day in Calcutta anymore. That's not permitted. But even to this day, they use giant pumpkins as stand-ins for bodies. They would smash pumpkins, or they would create giant human effigies, and they would slice the throat of the effigy as a substitute for a human life. So they're not allowed to murder people anymore, but some of the ideas are still there.
I wonder if that's where the name Smashing Pumpkins came from for the band.
You know, I haven't thought about that, but you never know. But so there is a dark side of Hinduism. People don't think of Hinduism as ever being bad, but if you really look at these tantric cults, it's pretty messed up. So again, you're thinking, okay, this is all in the past. Tantra's been cleaned up. Hinduism has been cleaned up. And again, you'd be wrong.
The ritual sacrifice is just
Doesn't
not
stop.
open, not done openly like it used to be,
No, it's a little
but
bit
it's
more
still being
underground.
done.
Oh yeah. And there was a case from 2002. Two men in the Indian state of Tripura beheaded a woman after receiving instructions from a god that appeared to them in their dreams and instructed them to kill this woman in order to curry favor with the god. And that opens up another can of worms of how do gods communicate with people many times in our dreams. May of the same year, again, 2002, police found the remains of two sisters aged 13 and 18 in Bihar. It's an area in India. They had been dismembered and offered to Kali by their father, and they had been ritually dismembered with a ceremonial sword. So their own father offered them up as a sacrifice in order to gain some advantage. And according to the author, Kali worship is becoming more and more popular with India, and millions of people are flocking to her worship. It's growing. And the sad thing is that really why people are flocking to Kali, it's one of those keeping up with the Joneses type things. So the author said that if you see someone who is in your caste, because in India they still have the caste system, you see somebody within your own caste who is going up in the world, job promotions, material gains, they're getting better and better, their life is getting better. You want to catch up. There's a very strong keeping up with the Joneses thing within the caste system. So people are turning to Kali, not because they desperately need help and they have no other way. No, just to keep up with the Joneses and to stay on track with their neighbors within the caste system.
Same thing with the cult of Moloch. It was about material gain. You would sacrifice your firstborn so that you would have
Mm-hmm.
more abundant crops and bigger family, but you had to sacrifice that first one first.
Yes. 2003, get this, this is interesting. 2003, Hindu monks in Pakistan mobilized to fight the quote, ancient barbaric rituals of human sacrifices that still occur in that country. They mentioned that many people in Tantra and Kali worship still believe that a child must be sacrificed in order to get magical powers or to have a wish granted. And even at the main temple of Tantra, which is called the Kamakhya temple, a man dressed in red robes, wearing red beads, I'm sorry, saffron robes, wearing red beads on his forehead, almost managed to sacrifice his 18-year-old daughter and was slicing through her neck with a razor before the screams of the daughter brought the attention of other worshippers who promptly stopped him. So this was in the middle of a church. He was trying to sacrifice the daughter, and the temple official stated that special volunteers in the temple have been assigned to prevent ritual killings from happening at the temple. Tantric temples are rumored to have the power to bring riches and to help childless couples conceive children or put curses on your enemies. This is happening in the middle of temples, and you need volunteers to stop the killing. So it it's still a modern day phenomenon. The author mentions in Africa, there's a place called Swaziland and also in Liberia. They say that ritual sacrifices are very common, particularly before elections. So, you think that the election cycle here in the U.S. is rough? Oh my God! In Africa, all candidates are ritually sacrificing people in order to increase their odds of being elected.
You don't think that's happened here?
You know what? I
Think
believe
again.
anything. Yes.
Think
Oh
again.
my God, I believe anything. In according to the author, as of 2005, this was still happening in Africa. They also talk about African juju magic, and this is very interesting. And this is playing on what you talked about adrenochrome. In juju magic tradition, they do ritual sacrifice to their gods in order to gain favor. But in the juju belief, they said that the more the victim suffers, the more power is gained with the gods who reside in the invisible world. Many practitioners claim that belief in magic isn't required for the spell to work. So even if you don't believe in the juju man's magic, you can still be affected by the spell. And I mean, thinking, and the author doesn't mention this, but I was thinking, as far as the research that I've done, there's definitely connections to Moloch worship here within political movements. You think of the connections with the sex slave cults, like the Nixium cult that was recently busted. Um, Human sacrifice is still happening, and I think that one of the reasons why this is so important that we talk about this and why it's good and it's very appropriate to the world of the occult is that we want to believe we really want to believe that we're so modern, we're so advanced that we left these barbaric practices behind. But just in reading this book and in the knowledge that I've gained by paying attention to news stories that point to this is still happening in modern times. The world of the occult, belief in devils and spirits can still affect you. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could be kidnapped and you could be the next sacrifice for a palero. You could be the next sacrifice for a politician somewhere. You just don't know. So it's still important for us to know this type of stuff, to be aware of this type of stuff. And next time you're looking through the news and you see a story of an unsolved murder where the body was missing the head and it appeared to be a ritual sacrifice, but the cops aren't sure, maybe you should look at that. And I urge our listeners to maybe look at that through this lens. Is it the world of the occult still creeping into modern life? And I really don't know. I mean, I don't have an answer for that, but I think the answer might be yes.
Well, things are coming out. The subject is bubbling over and spilling out into the outer world, and uh, things. I call it blunt force truth. A lot of blunt force truth is going to come out. A lot of people are going to be exposed for some very dark and ugly stuff. But the upside is, as pervasive as this cult of death might be, especially in the higher echelons of government and the so-called ruling elite, the upside is it is coming out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And we are going to become more aware. And in overcoming our ignorance, we will be better able to deal with the dark side of our society. because it is our society. We may want to ignore it, but it's it's going to get to the point where nobody's going to be able to ignore it.
Right. It's just so in our faces now that we can't pretend like it's not there anymore. And notice something else interesting. When human sacrifice happens, or when people kill for religion, particularly in the cases that were in this book, it's always interesting that the offer or the payback, it's always dealing with more mundane things. The people that are sacrificing either want money, sex, love, or to be cured of some type of disease or revenge against someone that they don't like. It's never I am sacrificing to bring world peace or some higher order.
No, you're feeding the dark gods, and the dark gods
Yes.
don't bring world peace.
And I'm glad that you brought up the term dark gods because I have a feeling, and there's books written about this, that not all gods are evil.
I think we're interdimensional beings, and some beings are darker, some beings are lighter, and think we're right smack in the middle of a spiritual war, a
Right.
spiritual material war, because it's definitely being played out in the material world.
So I think the big question is, what side of the war do you want to be on?
Exactly. You got to pick a side. All prophets have pointed to this point in known human history.
Yes.
This is the crossroads of human history, and you can serve the light or you can serve the dark,
Darkness.
but you got to choose. So choose wisely, my friends.
Yes. Because, life is only at best 99 years, maybe 100 years. And eternity is a long, long time.
Okay, folks. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much. I know I went a little bit long in the segment, but
Oh, and sorry about that loud, loud exclamation. I was frightened by a wild animal coming into my home.
AKA skunk.
Possum, actually.
Oh, wow. So we'll say hello to Mr. Possum. Thank you once again for being here. We truly appreciate your attention. We truly appreciate you being here. Please like and subscribe to our channel. And we will be back soon with more stories of the occult. And till then, keep your ears on the news, study up, don't believe everything you see. You have to verify and find out for yourself. Dante,
Yeah, it's not true until you experience it for yourself, until you prove it to yourself. But uh, uh, peace, love, and light.
be well.